I am in the middle of moving house, and I was sick last week, so I spent less time on these slides than I normally would have. So let's just see how this goes. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you today about one of the things that we as statisticians have to be quite concerned about when we are analyzing data, particularly from RCTs that have repeated measurements. As many of you are probably aware, if you do have a study in which you have people come back multiple times, you will run into the situation where they just don't. So you end up with missing data almost always. You have to work really hard in these longitudinal studies in order to avoid that. Usually these longitudinal studies are they're interested in looking at an intervention effect. So they often have an intervention and then some sort of conventional control, and they might be looking at a mean difference at a particular time point. That might be a primary outcome. Or they might have primary hypotheses about the actual change. Either or both of those hypotheses are very common in longitudinal RCTs. And when we have missing data, the estimation of those effects can be messed up a little bit. So we have some statistical treatments of our data and models that will help us get a better estimate of these things that we want to. There we go. So in the course of analyzing data from these longitudinal RCTs, we have a number of different ways that we can approach data that have missing values. The first one is complete case analysis. That means we exclude anyone with any missing values and our outcomes, and then do our analysis on that. And it is not recommended because there are systematic differences between people who provide complete observation, complete panel of your repeated measures, and the people who don't. So you really have a biased estimate of what's going on. We also have single imputation methods. So this is where we create a complete data set by one of a number of methods. So we can do something like last observation carried forward. So if you have 5 repeated measurements in your study design, and somebody's data only goes up to visit 3, you might take that visit 3 value and put it into the visit 4 and visit 5 slot for that particular person. You do that for anybody who has missing data, and hey, we have a complete data set, and now we can analyze it. There are also baseline replacement things, or mean replacement methods, but none of these is very good. You get a complete data set, that's great, but when you do that, you end up decreasing your standard error estimates. And that is important because our standard errors are what we use to do inference. So we use it when we're calculating our p-values. We use it when we're calculating the confidence interval around the effect that we're interested in. And if it's too small, then we're going to get too small p-values, and those confidence intervals are going to be inaccurate. So this is not such a great idea either. So instead, we might do what the vast majority of people who are analyzing these types of studies do now, is choose an analysis method that allows us to keep those people in who do have missing values. And so you might do linear mixed models with a random intercept or repeated measurements in there. You might use generalized estimating equations for longitudinal data. And these methods are really great because you get to keep everybody in your study who started out. So even if they have, maybe they only came up at the baseline visit or only returned once, you still can include that person's data in that primary analysis, which is really great. Unfortunately, it's not like the the best thing ever, because it's still based on some assumptions that are implicit and not explicit. But it's something that you need to know as a person who is analyzing your data, that assumes that any missing data that you have in your data set has particular mechanisms behind it. And I have these acronyms up here, MCAR or MAR. These stand for missing completely at random or missing at random. And I'll go into what that means on the next slide. Basically, it means that we can ignore it. As long as we've got a statistical model that allows us to keep those people in, we can ignore the fact that you've got some missing data, and we're still going to get a decent estimate of our treatment effect or the effective interest and the inference that goes with that estimate. And then often and increasingly, this is being required when you are looking at publishing RCTs. You need to provide multiple imputation if you've got some missing data in your data set. And in this general approach, use a statistical model to generate different instances of complete data based on the information in the data that you've actually observed. And this is based on a stochastic model, and so the variability that those single number imputation methods exclude is actually included in the process. So we can generate 25 or 50 possible data sets that could have sort of generated our means and standard deviations and variances and covariances amongst our variables. And then we estimate our model in each of those and then aggregate across them to get our final imputed estimate with its confidence interval. And again, we need to be very clear that we understand that this is good for data that are missing completely at random or data that are missing at random. Now, what does that mean, though? Okay, so missing completely at random is the best case scenario. It means that the presence of a missing value is not related to it's not dependent on measured or unmeasured variables. It just happens. So I like using this example because it's just so ridiculous. A friend of mine was a statistician for a survey-based trial, and this was way before they were doing research and collecting data online. So you had to fill out a survey and mail it in. And one day they got to the office, and the mailbox that collects their mail had been firebombed. So like, all these surveys from around the country were in the mailbox, and it was firebombed, and they lost them all. So they have a bunch of missing data from people who sent in their data, but it's not related to anything beyond the fact that somebody decided to set something on fire. So they're missing values, but they're not related to any of the variables that we measured, and they're not related to these. We assume they're not related to the actual values that you would have observed had you actually been able to look at those surveys. Now, so this is a pretty extreme example, and I will say that most of the time you actually don't have missing completely at random data. So it's kind of it's ideal if you're going to have missing data, but it's also not very probable. Missing at random is more likely, and these are data that are missing, and they are dependent on variables that you have measured. So, for example, if you were doing a trial looking at some sort of intervention for depression, you might find when you're looking at your data after you collected it that people with higher depression at baseline tended to drop out. But the thing is, you measured that. So you can include that information in your analysis model or your imputation model, and that's really good. So if you find that you have associations with the presence of missing values and a particular thing, baseline characteristics or measurements, that's good. I mean, It's not good because they have missing values, but it's good that you can go, oh, well, you know, as long as I'm accounting for it in my model, I can use my linear mixed model, and I'm not going to really be messing up my estimate of the treatment effect. Missing not at random is where the real issues come in. Now, missing not at random means missing values are dependent on variables that were not measured. And unfortunately, this means they are non-ignorable. That means that if you were just to run your linear mixed model, estimate your treatment effect in the confidence interval, you are getting an inaccurate estimate of what is actually going on. So what do I mean by missing not at random? Okay, so in the example of our trial for treatment of depression, you might have people who drop out, and it may be those people whose values are getting worse. So the missingness is related to the actual value of your outcome. But you don't know that because you haven't observed the outcome. But if you think about it, you're really missing out on some interesting information and important information in that longitudinal study if those people who just aren't responding or things are getting worse are not giving you that information. So if you do have missing not at random data, go away. You can cause the estimate of your treatment effect to be overestimated. If you have evidence of a beneficial effect of your intervention, and those people in the intervention group who are not responding or show worsening trajectories just don't come back, you got a false impression of what's going on in the people who are receiving this intervention. So you can end up with an overestimate of treatment effect. It can also result in the same type of situation like as you are in if you're doing complete case analysis, where you have a depressed standard error estimate. It should be bigger. And you might have bias in your estimate itself. So that's not good. Some big regulatory agencies have recommended that simply assuming missing at random is not enough. If you are not giving serious consideration to your missing data, having some sort of not at random mechanism behind it, you are not doing enough to interrogate your data. Now, the thing is, you can't show that your data are missing not at random. There's no way to prove this. And there's actually no way to prove that you got missing at random data. The only thing that we can do statistically to show anything in terms of the mechanism behind missingness is what's called Little's test for missing completely at random, which is a test to see whether you have missing completely at random data or not. And that's it. The rest, if we want to assume missing at random, we sort of have to support that with reasons, and probably some reasons why missing not at random is not really plausible, but that's going to be kind of hard. So I think it's probably best to think very carefully about what types of missing not at random data you probably have in your longitudinal trial, and do something about it. You know, at least show some addressing of this issue. And so we can do this in a sensitivity analysis. These agencies, so the European Medicine Agency, which the Therapeutics Goods Administration here has endorsed the European Medicines Agency statement on missing data. So they released it in 2010, but they have not updated it. Meaning that this is their current thinking on the subject. So they want you to do it. They want you to include some analyses that assume a missing not at random mechanism. and some sensitivity analyses and the assumptions that go into those that treatment, just to see what happens to the estimate of your treatment effect. The National Academies in the US, which is often sort of regulates or oversees studies in the behavioral and social sciences, sort of says the same thing. The sensitivity analyses need to be part of the primary reporting of results from clinical trials. And so this is something that's, while these are specific for, medical and pharmaceutical trials, I think it's generally a good thing to do if you are designing RCTs that have repeated measures. So if we are going to address these things, how do we do that? Well, from a statistical standpoint, there are typically there are 3 different approaches that we can take when we're doing these, and they are selection models. And these are models that combine mixed models, which allow for the repeated measures, and latent variable models together into generalized latent. There we go. Generalized linear, latent, and mixed models, GLAAMM. There are a couple of very popular ones for longitudinal data. So we have the Diggle-Kedward and the Wu-Carroll selection models. And these tend to have a binary latent indicator for whether or not somebody's, the probability of a missing value at a particular time point, and how that can affect subsequent observations. And so they do the mixed model and this binary latent variable model all at the same time, and then estimate the effect of interest. You can usually do this. Most often it's done in Stata using the GLAAMM procedure. You can also do this in M+. I am unaware of how easy it is to do it in R. I did not find anything that was that looked like exactly what I was looking for. But the thing is that it's hard. You have to do a lot of data manipulation, a lot of data wrangling, a lot of data coding, and coding of the model. And then once you get that done, it's not necessarily going to actually run. So these are hard models to estimate. Another option is the shared parameter model. You may have also heard this called joint models or joint modeling. And once again, it's sort of mashing 2 models together. Here we have our mixed model and for our longitudinal data, and we have a time to event as well. So in these models, we're modeling somebody's time to dropping out at the same time as we are modeling that change over time. And then we can estimate the effect while also accounting for somebody's hazard of dropping out across the course of the study. And once again, these are hard to estimate. There are some packages in R that I saw that you can do this in a very simple context. And so I imagine that there are ones that will allow you to extend it to more complex and longer RCT designs. But again, they are actually kind of hard to get to estimate altogether. So even for people who do statistics all the time, those 2 approaches take a lot of time and a lot of frustration to get something to get to your estimate in your sensitivity analysis. They're kind of frustrating and it's hard. The last option you have is a pattern mixture model, and there are these range from simple to quite complex, and I'm going to show you a simple one. And this is something that you, as a researcher with some knowledge of how to analyze data in these contexts, you can do yourself, and it's easy. And if you've already done your imputation, which you probably have, at least in your stats analysis plan. You may have already done your imputation. If so, you've got some imputed data sets. You're almost all the way there. You've already done the really hard part. And doing this method of a pattern mixture model, then it's going to be really easy for you. Okay, so typically in when you're analyzing your data in these longitudinal trials, you would do something like, hey, I'm going to do my primary analysis. It's intention to treat. The data that we have are the data that we have. And you analyze it using your linear mixed model or generalized linear mixed model or whatever. And then you define some sensitivity analyses. And some people may choose to do your complete case, or you might do best, worst, worst, best. These are sort of ways to get an estimate of if the worst happened and my intervention made people more depressed, or if it made them really, really happy. You know, what's the range of treatment differences we might find? But of course, we already know that those complete case or those single imputation approaches are not really good, and we should probably include some more variability in our hypothetical data sets. So you do your imputation, and you can combine those, the treatment effect estimates across your imputed data sets to get your overall treatment effect. And now we can move on to our treatment of the missing not at random assumptions or possible mechanisms with our pattern mixture model. We can define a rule about how a missing not at random mechanism could be happening in our data. So maybe our intervention is quite onerous. Maybe in our depression trial, it requires people to be in group therapy for 3 hours a day, and for 4 weeks, and so it's really quite intense and hard, and you get a lot of dropouts. This is one of the things that happens is that people who are feeling worse or just not responding at all to this really intensive therapy drop out more often than people who are maybe are showing some benefit. Okay, so we're focusing on people in the intervention group. And if they have any missing data, they're probably, according to our rule, their values are probably lower than what our imputation model predicts. So, we can define our model. Maybe we'll say, hey, those values, that score is about 10% lower. We're assuming that a higher value of our outcome in the depression trial is better. They're feeling better. But these people who dropped out are actually doing worse than what our imputation model would expect. So we can tweak those imputed values by decreasing them by about 10%, and then recalculating our effect size. So I'm going to show you in a very simple trial how to do this. This is real data from Jane Koloff, who's in the Department of Psychiatry here. She studies different treatment methods and for behavior problems in toddlers. So these are toddlers that are less than 24 months old. And she's looking at the application of parent-child interaction therapy. And it's pretty intensive therapy focused on altering a parent's behavior in response to problematic child behavior. And this was an RCT with 3 arms. We had the intervention, which is the PCITT, and active control, which is the COSP, circle of security, and that's sort of conventional therapy modality. And then there was a waitlist control as well. There are 3 time points, post-treatment, and then a 4-month follow-up. And just to let you know, the waitlist group only has the first 2 because they had to wait for any treatment at all. So the length of the study didn't allow them 4 months follow-up. They needed to get their actual treatment as soon as possible. So we only have 2 time points for the waitlist group. And the main research questions are, we're looking at group differences at that post-treatment time point, and they had some parental outcomes and toddler outcomes, and they also had some questions about change between time points. And these are some descriptive statistics for one of their parental outcomes. And you can see that there are about 27 or 26 dyads at baseline. And at post-treatment, there is some dropout and quite a bit in the conventional therapy. And then by the follow-up, the 4-month follow-up, we have lots of missing data in the active control, and had about 11 dropouts in the intervention group. These are the means. So you can see that there is, for the two intervention groups, the active control and the intervention group, there's an increase in sensitivity. Higher scores are better. So we want to see that increase, and then a slight decrease by follow-up, but we're mostly just interested in this post treatment comparisons here. And then, of course, if you are doing your analysis, you always want to look at your spaghetti plots to see what's going on. And you can see that there's quite a lot of people increasing in the intervention group. It's harder to say in the active control because so many people dropped out very quickly. But there is some increasing there, and then there's just not a lot consistently happening in our waitlist group. Okay, so our primary analysis is a linear mixed model, and with a random effect for individual to account for the repeated measures, and fixed effects for time and group and the interaction, and then planned comparisons of the intervention versus the active control and the waitlist group at post-treatment time point. And we can see that the estimate for the active control versus interventions about 9.5, and against waitlist it's 12.5, and both of these show small p-values. But we have lots of missing data, so of course we had planned on doing some imputation. So we did multiple imputation, was performed to have quite a few outcomes. So all of those were used in the imputation model, and there were additional baseline predictors such as child age, parent education level, and things like that. And here I'm just showing you some of the data from the imputations, one for one of the people in the intervention group and one for the people in the circle of security, the active control. Both these people dropped out after the pre-treatment measurement. So we can see here we have missing values, but then these are two of the imputed data sets, their values for the imputed data sets. And then we can run the analysis in each of our imputation data sets and aggregate. And you can see that when you do the imputation, the treatment effect decreases a bit for the intervention versus active control, and our p-value is higher. Then in the versus the waitlist, not much happens, which is interesting. So there's a lot going on here, and that is because we had so much missing data in that active control group, and so you see a lot of movement there. Okay, so now we can move on to addressing the possibility that we have missing not at random mechanism going here. So we have to choose how are we going to do this. With shared parameter modeling, we've only got 3 time points. And if you think back about what the shared parameter is, it's including that time to event analysis. So we're not going to get very satisfying results when we've only got 2 follow-up time points. So it's really not an appropriate choice in this context. A selection model could be where we are modeling the presence or absence of an observed data point at each of the follow-up time points, and then doing our estimate of the effect in that GL-AAMM context. We could. Absolutely, that's, we could do that, but we could also go, oh my gosh, I don't feel confident in my modeling skills. And I've never used Stata before or M+. This is going to take me months to figure out what I'm doing. Maybe I can do a decent treatment for this very simple RCT using a pattern mixture model, where we're assuming that people in the intervention group who drop out, have these missing values at post-treatment and 4-month follow-up are not showing as much benefit. So that sensitivity value is slightly lower than the imputation model predicts. So we can lower each of those values in the intervention group by about 10%. So we can define our sort of factor at 0.9. And we can just, in our imputation data, if we have an imputed value in the intervention group at post-TX or the 4-month follow-up, decrease it a little bit. And so you can see here now, went from 98.7 to 88.8 for this person in the intervention group, but the person's imputed values in the active control don't change. So we're only affecting that intervention group value. And then we can do the same thing that we did when we were doing our multiple imputation, run the model in each of the data sets, and estimate our treatment effect. And now we can see that we're down to a 4.6 point difference, mean difference, and we have a lower confidence bound that goes beyond 0. That means that under this assumption of missing not at random, as defined by our rule, we no longer have evidence to suggest that PCIT results in higher sensitivity. Parental sensitivity. But again, we still have a difference. It's better than doing nothing, says the comparison against the wait list. So it may not be better than right now in terms of maternal sensitivity than the active control, but it's better than doing nothing. Now we can extend this a little bit to get a bit more of a look at what might be going on by what's called a tipping point analysis, where we just do the same thing, but we change that delta value. So I decreased it by 10%, so a delta of 0.9, but I could also have that delta being 0.8, 0.7, 0.6. And it's basically just sort of a systematic look at, if the missing not at random mechanism is assumed that the people who have missing data in that intervention group are really not getting any benefit at all, or like just very little. What happens to our inference based on our primary outcome? And we already saw that in the comparison against the active control, we no longer have evidence of a difference. But it takes almost to, at a delta of 0.8, so decreasing it by 20% almost gets to that point where we say that we don't have evidence of a difference when we're looking at it versus the waitlist control. Okay, so it's a relatively accessible method to interrogate your data from a missing not at random perspective, but you can do other things like you can do the tipping point analysis, but you can also have more than one rule. And in fact, if you've got more measurement occasions, more than just 2 or 1, you're going to notice that you actually have different patterns of missing data. You can include a rule for each of those different patterns. So maybe you have people who drop out after baseline. You've got people who come back once. You've got people who come back, 3 times, or you have people that just miss, the second follow-up, and then come back for the final thing. So these are all sort of different situations that and you can think about how the missing not at random mechanism is occurring in each of those situations. And you can also define rules for more than your intervention group. Like, we should probably think about what's going on in our active control group, considering how much missing data was in that one. Yeah, my guess is that it probably has to do with the people aren't blinded to what treatment they're getting. And maybe they were disappointed that they were in the active control group rather than this cool PCIT modality. And so they were less, motivated to return. I don't know. But you can include more than one rule, and you should if you've got lots of different missing data patterns. And you can run a bunch of those into a sort of more complex tipping point analysis. So I did it for a few different levels of what's going on in our active control group. This is sort of the tipping point analysis that I showed you before. This panel right here is saying, hey, the people in that active control are those people with missing values are also not doing so great. So we'll decrease their values a little bit as well. And then this one over here is that the people who are in the active control and missing are actually doing better. I don't know. So you can see that the pattern changes, like the things shift based on what your assumption is in the two combinations. You look like you have a question.
Yeah. It
Yes.
feels like if you put in, if you've made the assumption that p-value kind of like, chicken and egg, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They're like the question is about your assumptions. How do I know they're good? Yeah, that's the thing. I don't. Yeah, I don't have any idea. But the thing is, you as a substantive researcher have an idea of what is a reasonable thing that might have happened. I don't. I'm a statistician. I just know the numbers. But yeah.
There's a lot of conflict in it, right?
Yeah.
You give the grants, get this research to implement this thing. You want it to work.
Right. You do want it to work. And so you really do have to be honest. And
Like it's a guess.
it is a guess. It absolutely is a guess. But you need to. If you were to do a missing not at random analysis and you were only choosing things to make yourself look good, somebody's going to notice. Because one of the things that you actually do in general when you're doing these types of things is choose assumptions that really test whether your intervention is good. Yeah, you're like, if you are a good researcher, you're trying to break it. You should be.
You're doing these as sensitivity analysis, right? So it's not like you're saying, I think this is the truth.
Right.
You're saying, for our main analysis, we found some result, and it looks like it's probably working, but there might be some problems.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of how much of a problem we can tolerate and still find it.
Yep. Yeah.
So you're giving yourself credit for it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, I'm not saying that any of these things are actually happening. I'm saying that they are possibilities, and we're just poking at what happens to our effect estimate if the worst thing that could happen did, in that the intervention people who didn't come back actually are really low and the active control people are really high, in which case we don't have any evidence of any effect at all. Yeah. So then your job is to say, well, it looks like for maternal sensitivity, we may not have a lot of evidence that PCIT helps for this thing, but we've got these other outcomes, which I didn't show here, that are more behavioral rather than emotional, that really show huge effects, and these things would look quite different.
So would it be some sort of, you have the best words, best substitutes, sort of the middle point?
Yeah, yes.
Going to the extremes. I
Yeah.
think that there's mostly only a shift of 10% or whatever, and then a difference in there.
Mhm.
I get that.
Yes. Yeah. So this is a way of combining a bunch of different scenarios together. Yes.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Sunglasses, my glasses didn't arrive yet. But just a question in relation to her question. I'm not really in the medical side, but more in like finance, cybernetics, that sort of data harvesting aspect of it. So a lot of what we see, usually you do medical things and you get your data sets together, you've got academic governing boards that kind of tell you line when it comes to it. But when we're dealing with economics, finance, and statistical models, for example, in data into behavioral economics, at least this could be applied to me.
Mhm.
We do have issues where, and you see this even in government as well. It's not necessarily the data is false. It's just that you've got issues of like, I would say, actually it is false data. It's false data or it's data that's not ethically sourced. So it could be replicated data that we don't know is either human generated or it's multiplied by, bots and drones and that kind of thing, and bots on the systems. We've got that kind of glitches. And for me, how would you, it's not really with regards to missing data, but we're saying inaccurate data that correlates. How would you say that would be ethically sourced?
That's a really interesting question. And you would have are you saying that you don't have any idea where if this particular data set is true? Or, yeah.
Yeah. The baseline.
That's a really good question. I guess, at the very baseline, then you could, if there's any, information about the generation process for those data, you can look at that very carefully. And if there's any question, I suppose you could, do something similar to a pattern mixture, approach here, where you're tweaking the values a little bit to say, if, I'm not so sure that these variables in this data set are really representative of what's going on. I actually think that they're higher. So if they were higher by 20%, what's the relationship between these things, or the group difference? So you could do something like that, but I'm sure there's got to be better ways to incorporate that uncertainty than this approach.
Yeah.
Because this is pretty basic. This is really basic, and I'm showing it to you. I want to talk about it because the missing not at random issue and treatments of it are really hard. They're really hard to implement, particularly for people who don't have a lot of training and experience in coding these things. And for something like that, I would think that people who are doing AI type research or deep learning or machine learning type stuff, they probably have really good ways to incorporate that in their model already. Yeah, so, and I am not a person who does any of that. Yeah, so I can't talk intelligently on it.
No problem.
But they're very smart. So.
Most of the issues false data more than missing data.
Yeah.
I would think sometimes it falls into the same kind of Venn diagram of issues.
Yeah.
Right? It's like you can't use it as false data. It correlates back to, it's probably equivalent to missing data. We can't use it.
Right. Yeah.
Especially ethical concerns in it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so some recommendations. This way of applying a pattern mixture model, it's a relatively accessible method for people who are analyzing their data and need to incorporate some sort of assumptions about missing not at random mechanisms into your sensitivity analyses. It's based on imputed data, so you have that variability built into those data sets, which is really good. And it's relatively simple to implement. It's really just tweaking those values according to rules that you have specified. And hopefully you've specified some reasonable rules. Yeah. You can define more than one rule at a time based on substantive knowledge of you as a researcher hold. Yeah, so I've talked a little bit about the active control. A warning that, like I said, this is not universally the best choice. And in fact, it can be a pretty poor choice depending on the data that you have in front of you. This is accessible, but it may not be a very good choice for you. And if this is something that you need to do, you probably should talk to an expert and say, hey, I was planning on doing this. Does that make sense? Hopefully it'll be a decent choice, and you can go ahead and do it yourself. Otherwise, you're probably going to have a nice collaboration with somebody who does lots of coding. It's useful mostly when there are only a small number of repeated measures, because otherwise you end up with lots of different patterns. And you probably should have some rules, maybe not for every single different pattern, but for, you know, you probably want more than one rule in general. If you have data that are measured longitudinally, but not at regular time points, it's not going to help you out. So it's really sort of a, under very certain circumstances, this is a decent option for somebody who is trying to avoid those really difficult models. And it's relatively easy to do. Okay, so some references. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Say you are looking at your data, and there's no statisticians anywhere.
Okay.
Is there a good place to go and pick your not or your like to assess models? Like, is there a good, I don't know, big.
I would start with the references that I have here. There are a couple of easy to read applications of some of them. So I would do that, and don't get too hung up on equations. Just, you know, read the text. They have to have the equations to show that, yes, this is a, you know, this is what's actually happening in the statistics. But for people who don't have that experience and knowledge, it can be intimidating. Skip the equations and just read the text and maybe the examples. That'll help you figure out why they chose to do this and what it's gaining them. Yes.
Sorry. I mentioned a test on ranking rate for the amount, but it's just to kind of test the accuracy of a data set, especially with the missing data. If you look at the kind of test, how accurate would you think that they would be when you compare your data sets with them? Do you think there's a possibility that if you use data sets with missing data, obviously with this formula to kind of even up your conclusions, do you think that will the test reflect an accurate kind of conclusion that you're receiving as well?
You mean when you do a sensitivity analysis? Yeah. I don't know that anybody can can give you any answer to that with any certainty whatsoever. Sensitivity analyses are hypotheticals, and some of them are more plausible substantively than others. Some of them are better statistically than others, and that's as far as we can go. So that, like, the best way to evaluate whether a particular sensitivity analysis is giving you a decent estimate of your effective interest is to make sure it's statistically sound. So it's got, you know, technical backing to it, and substantively sound. So me as a statistician, I know almost nothing about like anything in the world. So me choosing values is just really bad. That's why I work with the people who actually know the stuff, because they can tell me if those values are good. Any questions online? No. Yes.
So just, I guess in terms of testing that the model you chose is accurate, is there any way you can sort of say, okay, so I've got this much missing data, I've applied this model to sort of impute that data. If I remove a set of data random, like I guess starting if your data is like missing at random or missing, there was that Little's test that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But can you like remove some of your data as like a test set, which you can then?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, you probably could. If you got enough data, you could probably do your analysis on, you know, one part of it, and then look at what happens in a test thing. Most people won't do that with RCTs though, because they have very limited resources. Yeah, yeah, it's really expensive. Yeah, and it's hard to get the data, but I suppose you could. Yeah, and just see what happens in that that testing data set.
in the chat.
Mhm.
Does this also apply to missing covariate data that could have those?
In what sense? In terms of like its effect on as a covariate adjusting model? Yeah, I mean, like this is mainly focused on sort of a primary outcome data and using covariates at baseline in an imputation model to get as you know as good imputed data sets as you can. And sometimes you have some missing covariate data as well, but you can impute that at the same time. I'm not sure if that, I have no idea if that answered the question.
Can you hear me? I can expand. You probably can't hear me.
This is not, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, hold on. We're trying to, we can hear that somebody's speaking, but we can't hear you.
Okay, maybe change it to the.
Okay. Yeah. Can you speak again?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Okay, so we have a longitudinal data set, and we often have missing covariate data, which is collected. Well, we have the two things. We do have people who drop out. That's obviously the issue that you were talking about. But we as well often impute our covariate data, like so our baseline covariate data, and like we make assumptions about whether it's missing at random, and we can get feedback from reviewers saying, how do you know if this is missing at random? Like what should we be doing?
Oh, yeah, like that's a really good question. It's not something I even considered putting in here because it's on outcomes, but I suppose you could do something very similar here where like if you have missing covariate data at baseline and you have to impute it, you could probably tweak those imputed covariate values. That's if your analysis model is including baseline covariate adjustment. Because if you do that and your primary analysis isn't adjusting for anything, it's not going to do anything.
Yeah.
So I suppose if you are your treatment or your estimate of interest is an adjusted effect, then it would have some consequences for that. And you could look at it in a similar way as we did here. If your effective interest is not adjusted, then it's not going to do anything.
Okay, cool.
Is there anything else?